Imagine marrying a millionaire, thinking your life was about to change forever, only to discover a chilling secret that would shake your world. This is the story of a young girl who believed she had found a way out of poverty, only to realize that not everything is as it seems. Hello guys, welcome to Stories of Hope. Before we start this incredible story, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? Tell me the name of your city or country. Sophie had spent most of her life struggling to make ends meet. Born into a broken family, she grew up in a small, crumbling apartment on the outskirts of town. Her mother worked tirelessly as a cleaner, barely managing to put food on the table, while her father had left when she was just a child. At only 22, Sophie had already faced more hardship than most people her age. With no college degree and no stable job, she often found herself working late shifts at a rundown diner, earning just enough to survive. She dreamed of escaping her harsh reality, of living a life where she didn't have to worry about bills or where her next meal would come from. Then, one evening, everything changed. A wealthy older man named Charles Montgomery walked into the diner. He was a 73-year-old millionaire, a man who had built his fortune through real estate and investments. Despite his age, he had a certain charm, and more importantly, he had money. Lots of it. Charles had been dining alone that night when he struck up a conversation with Sophie. Unlike other customers who barely acknowledged her, he listened to her, asked about her life, and even left a generous tip. It wasn't long before he started visiting the diner regularly, always sitting at the same table, always requesting Sophie as his waitress. At first, she thought nothing of it. But then, Charles made an offer that left her speechless. "Sophie," he said one evening, looking at her with a gentle smile, "you're a bright, beautiful young woman. I can see that life has been hard on you. But what if I told you I could change that? What if I told you I could give you everything you've ever wanted?" She laughed nervously. "And what would I have to do for that?" His next words sent shivers down her spine. "Marry me." Sophie was stunned. She barely knew this man. But at the same time, the idea of a life free from struggle was tempting. No more worrying about rent, no more sleepless nights working at the diner, no more hunger. After weeks of consideration, she made a decision that would change her life forever. She said yes. The wedding was small but extravagant, a lavish ceremony at Charles's mansion where she stood in a designer gown, surrounded by guests she didn't even know. She felt like she was living in a dream. For the first time in her life, she felt secure, safe. But that feeling wouldn't last, because just 1 week after the wedding, she stumbled upon something that sent chills down her spine. Something she was never supposed to see. Sophie had always dreamed of living in a mansion, of waking up in silk sheets instead of a lumpy mattress in her tiny apartment. Now, that dream was real. But why did it feel so wrong? From the moment she stepped into Charles Montgomery's luxurious estate as his wife, something felt off. The house was massive, too massive. Rooms stretched endlessly, decorated with antique furniture, chandeliers dripping with crystals, and paintings that looked like they belonged in a museum. Yet, despite its beauty, the house felt cold, lifeless, as if no one had truly lived in it for a long time. Charles was kind, at least on the surface. He never raised his voice, never made her feel uncomfortable. He bought her expensive jewelry, silk dresses, and even promised to take her on vacations to Paris and Italy. But he was also distant. Every night, after dinner, he would retreat to his private study, locking the door behind him. Sometimes she heard voices, whispers, muffled conversations, but when she asked him about it, he simply smiled and changed the subject. And then there was the staff. The maids, the butlers, the gardeners, every single one of them looked at her with the same expression. Pity, fear, as if they knew something she didn't. One night, Sophie woke up feeling restless. The mansion was eerily silent, except for the faint ticking of an old grandfather clock in the hallway. She turned to Charles's side of the bed. Empty. Again. It was the third night in a row that he had disappeared in the middle of the night. Determined to find out what was going on, she quietly slipped out of bed and made her way down the dimly lit hallway. As she passed by the study, she noticed a faint glow of candlelight seeping through the cracks of the door. Her heart pounded. She leaned in, pressing her ear against the wood. Whispers, but not just Charles's voice. There were others, deep, hushed voices, speaking in tones that sent chills down her spine. She knew she shouldn't, but curiosity got the better of her. Slowly, carefully, she turned the doorknob. To her surprise, it wasn't locked. She pushed the door open just an inch, just enough to peek inside. What she saw made her blood run cold. Charles was standing at the center of the room, surrounded by 3 other men, each one dressed in black, their faces partially hidden by shadows. The room was filled with papers, photographs, and a large, worn-out map spread across the desk. But what caught her attention the most was the safe that sat open behind Charles. Stacks of cash, documents. But there, in the middle of it all, was something else. A box. A small wooden box covered in symbols she didn't recognize. One of the men pointed at it. "Are you sure she doesn't suspect anything?" Charles let out a deep sigh. She's young, naive. She thinks she married me for money, but she has no idea what she's really a part of now. Sophie's breath hitched. What she's really a part of now, what did that mean? She took a step back, her mind racing. She needed to get out of there before they saw her, but just as she turned to leave, the old wooden floor beneath her creaked. Silence. Then, a deep voice. "Did you hear that?" Sophie's heart stopped. Before she could move, the study door swung open, and there stood Charles. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, were locked onto hers. "Sophie," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "What are you doing up so late?" She swallowed hard, forcing a shaky smile. I couldn't sleep. I was just going to get some water." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick, heavy. Then Charles's lips curled into a slow smile. "Of course, my dear," he said smoothly. "Let me get it for you." He stepped aside, allowing her to walk past him. But as she did, she could feel the weight of his stare on her back. Something wasn't right. She had to find out the truth. But first, she had to survive the night. Sophie barely slept that night. She lay in bed, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. Charles had seen her outside the study. He knew she had heard something, but he hadn't confronted her, not yet. That was the part that scared her the most. The next morning, the atmosphere in the mansion felt different. The staff avoided eye contact even more than usual. The butler, who always greeted her with a polite nod, kept his head down. The maid who usually brought her breakfast left it on the table without a word. Something was wrong. She needed to know what was inside that mysterious wooden box. She needed to know what Charles meant when he said she was a part of something now. So she waited. That night, as soon as Charles retreated to his study, Sophie made her move. She crept down the hallway, her bare feet barely making a sound on the cold marble floor. Her hands trembled as she reached for the doorknob, half expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. The room was exactly as it had been the night before. The map, the stacks of cash, the open safe. But the wooden box, that was what she was looking for. She stepped closer, her fingers hovering over the intricate carvings on its surface. There was something unsettling about it, something ancient, almost sacred. She took a deep breath and opened it. Inside, she found letters, old letters, yellowed with age. Some were addressed to Charles, others to people she didn't recognize. She picked one up, unfolding it carefully. "Mr. Montgomery, we expect full payment before the end of the month. We do not tolerate delays. You know the consequences." Her blood ran cold. Payment? Consequences? What was Charles involved in? She rifled through more letters, her eyes scanning the words frantically. Some mentioned offshore accounts, others spoke of debts, massive debts. And then she found the letter that made her knees buckle. "Mr. Montgomery, the girl is your only way out. She must sign the papers. Do whatever it takes." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The girl. Her. A horrifying realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Charles hadn't married her out of love. He hadn't married her out of loneliness. He had married her because he needed something from her, something that could save him. Before she could process what it all meant, she heard footsteps. She spun around just as the door creaked open. Charles stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I was wondering when you'd finally put the pieces together." Sophie's stomach twisted. "What is this, Charles? Who are you in debt to?" He sighed, stepping into the room. "I had hoped you wouldn't find out this way. But since you have..." He walked over to the desk, picking up one of the letters as if it were nothing more than a grocery list. "I owe money, Sophie. A lot of money. And the people I owe it to, let's just say they aren't very forgiving." Sophie's voice shook. "What does this have to do with me?" Charles finally met her eyes. "Because, my dear, the only way to clear my debt is through you. If you sign over certain assets, if you become the legal owner of certain properties, then they'll leave me alone." Sophie's heart pounded. "You married me for my name on a piece of paper." He tilted his head. "And for your youth. No one questions a grieving young widow inheriting her late husband's fortune." A sickening wave of nausea rolled through her. "You're planning to kill me." Charles smiled. "Not personally, but accidents happen all the time, don't they?" Panic surged through her veins. She had to get out. Now, before he could react, Sophie grabbed the wooden box and threw it at his face. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The impact stunned him just long enough for her to shove past him and run. She sprinted down the long hallway, her breath coming in gasps. The staff saw her, but no one stopped her. They knew. They had always known. She burst through the front doors, her bare feet hitting the cold gravel driveway. But she didn't stop running. Not until she was far, far away from that house. 6 months later, Sophie sat in a small cafe, sipping a cup of tea as she read the headlines on her phone. Real estate mogul Charles Montgomery found dead in his estate. Authorities suspect foul play. She exhaled slowly. After she escaped, she had gone straight to the police, handing over every letter she had taken from the study. An investigation had been launched, and it didn't take long for Charles's past to catch up with him. The very people he had been indebted to, the same people he had hoped to escape by using her, had finally come to collect. Sophie was free. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to worry about money. She had started fresh, far away from the mansion, far away from the nightmares. And most importantly, she had survived. She looked up at the sky, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. "I thought money would save me," she whispered to herself, "but I learned that freedom is worth so much more." A small smile tugged at her lips. She had her whole life ahead of her now, and this time she would build it on her own terms. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Stories of Hope. We bring you more real-life stories filled with suspense, emotions, and powerful life lessons. See you in the next story. Blast off.